Dose: Child Labor in America. During colonial times, through the first half of the 19th century, child labor was an important part of agriculture and the handicraft economies of the time, employing children on family farms or as indentured servants, while young boys entering the trades began apprenticeships by age 10 to 14. But when the Industrial Revolution in America witnessed the rise of factories, children became ideal candidates for a variety of reasons, including less wages and almost no ability to organize into labor unions. As immigration into the United States increased in the 19th and early 20th centuries, children under the age of 16 became an increasingly important resource for profit-hungry business owners, growing to 18% of the American labor force by 1900. By the mid-19th century, educational reformers began a concerted pushback against child labor practices, impressing upon the American public that proper education was a dire necessity if the nation was to prosper as a whole. During the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Progressive-era reformers made the end of child labor an important part of their cause, and after the National Child Labor Committee organized in 1904, reformers employed an array of tactics to increase public awareness regarding the filthy, oftentimes hazardous conditions experienced by child laborers, including investigations by experts, the use of photography to spark public outrage, persuasive congressional lobbying campaigns, and mass mailings to the public at large. A constitutional amendment was passed by Congress in 1924. However, state pushback, particularly southern states, killed any chance for ratification. The end finally came when the Great Depression left thousands of adult Americans without jobs, leading to FDR's sweeping New Deal reforms, which in effect removed children from the workforce. In 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act set a national minimum wage for the first time in American history, at the same time limiting worker hours and making the use of children under 16 years of age illegal in manufacturing and mining. Individual states also began increasing the number of years of schooling required for certain jobs, while lengthening the school year and strictly enforcing truancy laws, making child labor a disgraceful yet bygone era in American history. Today in the Daily Dose, Eugene Debs. Born in 1855, Terre Haute, Indiana, Eugene V. Debs began his career as a railroad worker, rising up to become a clear voice in America's budding labor movement, which accelerated throughout the early decades of the 20th century. After founding the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen, in 1893, Debs stepped up yet again to found the American Railway Union, or ARU, which became the most powerful American labor union of its day. A year later, Debs and the ARU initiated a successful strike against the Pullman Palace Car Company in response to wage cuts without a commensurate reduction of worker rents in the company town of Pullman, Illinois, which disrupted rail traffic in 27 states west of Chicago, giving rise to violent clashes with law enforcement, culminating in a July 7th bloodbath when National Guardsmen opened fire on protesters, killing an estimated 70 strikers while injuring 57 more. Given a 6-month sentence for violating a court injunction against the strike, while in prison, Debs became a committed socialist after studying socialist primers such as Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto, going on to found the Socialist Party of America after his release from prison. During the high-water years of the Progressive era, all at a time when conservative Americans began to fear striking workers and the socialist communist sympathies pandemic within immigrant diasporas of the early 20th century, Debs ran for president as the party's socialist candidate from 1900 to 1920, winning nearly 1 million votes during the presidential election of 1912. A staunch anti-capitalist, Debs used his fiery rhetoric to preach his belief that American workers should control the production of products during the peak years of the American Industrial Revolution. And when America entered the First World War, his many anti-war speeches landed him a 10-year prison sentence under the Sedition Act of 1918. Pardoned in 1921 by President Warren G. Harding, Debs received a hero's welcome home to Terre Haute, replete with marching bands and a crowd of some 50,000 supporters. Nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize by Finnish socialist Karl H. Weick, Debs passed away at Lindlar Sanitarium in Elmhurst, Illinois, after years of declining health caused by his prison confinement, making the life and activism of Eugene Debs an early lodestar for left-leaning Americans. Today in the Daily Dose, Panic of 1893. After 2 decades of robust Gilded Age growth and prosperity, including an oversupply of silver due to a massive strike in Nevada's Comstock lode, as well as a gross overreach in the American railroad industry, a confluence of disastrous events led to the Panic of 1893, effectively crushing the American economy and the American spirit, with a stunning cascade of bank failures, bankruptcies, and foreclosures, not to be equaled until the Great Depression of the 1930s. Troubles began on February 20th, 1893, just 12 days after President Grover Cleveland was sworn into office, when the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad, followed by the National Cordage Company, 2 of the nation's largest employers, filed for receivership, while the lingering effects of a wheat crop failure and an unsuccessful coup in Argentina encouraged skittish European investors to sell their American stock holdings, which in turn started a run on gold in the U.S. Treasury, since specie, or coins minted of precious metals, were deemed safer than paper money. Convinced that an oversupply of silver was at the heart of the nation's crisis, Cleveland convinced Congress to repeal the Sherman Silver Purchase Act of 1890, creating a credit crunch that rippled throughout world economies. As stock prices on Wall Street began their precipitous tumble, a domino effect of financial collapses soon followed, including bankruptcies for the Northern Pacific and Union Pacific Railroads, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, 500 regional and national banks, and more than 15,000 companies across the United States. At the Depression's peak, which dragged on until 1897, unemployment reached 17 to 19% nationally, with some states recording even higher figures such as 35% in New York and 43% in Michigan, causing once secure middle-class Americans to walk away from home mortgages they could no longer afford. Facing starvation, many in the fallen middle class accepted manual labor jobs in exchange for food, while many women resorted to prostitution as a means of feeding hungry children back home. The American president took the brunt of a struggling nation's blame, and when the U.S. Treasury fell to dangerously low levels of specie, he was forced to borrow $65 million from Wall Street banker J.P. Morgan and Great Britain's Rothschild banking family. Combined with the bloody Pullman strike of 1894, Cleveland's Democratic Party suffered massive losses in the midterm elections of 1894, followed by Republican President William McKinley's landslide victory in the presidential election of 1896, making the Panic of 1893 another worst hard time in American history. Today on the Daily Dose, the Black Friday gold scandal of 1869. Known for their robber baron clout on Wall Street and their complete lack of scruples, Jay Gould and Jim Fisk, president and vice president respectively of the Erie Railroad, trailed a long list of prior shady deals, including the issuance of fraudulent stocks and bribing public officials and judges, all in an effort to line their pockets with untold riches. Dubbed the Mephistopheles of Wall Street for his ability to line his pockets, in early 1869, Gould devised a way to corner the gold market, enlisting Fisk in his scheme, who contributed some $7 million, and Abel Corbin, a former Washington bureaucrat who just happened to be married to President Ulysses S. Grant's sister. At the time of their scheme, gold remained the official currency for international trade, while the U.S. itself had gone off the gold standard in lieu of federally backed greenbacks originally used to fund the Union's Civil War efforts. After Corbin gained assurances from Grant that the nation's leader had changed his mind regarding selling off some of the Treasury's gold to stabilize the Wall Street gold market, Gould and his fellow conspirators began quietly stockpiling gold during the late summer of 1869, driving prices trading on the New York Stock Exchange Gold Room from $100 a unit to 141 greenbacks in August alone, trapping speculators and short sellers in a sudden financial vice. By late September, Grant had his wife send a letter to Corbin demanding he cease and desist, while in true robber baron fashion, Gould began selling off his gold at an enormous profit, at the same time concealing his trades from his colluding partners. With gold prices now topping $145 a unit, on September 24, 1869, now known as Black Friday, Grant ordered the Treasury Department to sell $4 million in gold reserves, sending not only gold prices, but Wall Street stock prices in general into a precipitous downward tailspin, bankrupting or severely damaging many of Wall Street's most venerable investment houses. Thousands of high-rolling Wall Street speculators met with near-instant financial ruin, while foreign trade ceased altogether, further destroying many farmers when wheat and corn prices fell by 50%. Ripples from Black Friday depressed the U.S. economy for several years to come, at the same time casting a blight on the remainder of Grant's tenure as president. Both Gould and Fisk would use their political connections to avoid even a day of jail time, and while exact numbers are hard to come by, Gould's Black Friday profits netted him somewhere in the neighborhood of $12 million, or some $450 million in today's currency, making the gold scandal of 1869 the first Black Friday event in American history. Today in the Daily Dose, the Great Steel Strike of 1919. In the lead-up to America's entry into the First World War, a sense of nationalism stoked tensions within the immigrant diaspora of most industrialized regions of the United States, and after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917 toppled the reign of Tsar Nicholas II in lieu of socialist leaders like Vladimir Lenin, anxious Americans cast a suspicious eye upon labor unions, immigrants in general, African Americans, and the worry over the spread of homegrown socialism. As the nation's entry into the war caused labor shortages as able-bodied American men took up arms instead of shovels, labor unions, the federal government, and industrial employers became odd bedfellows under the guise of the War Labor Board, so chartered to fend off labor strikes through active mediation, which in turn witnessed a marked increase in worker pay, while daily work hours dropped from 12 to 8. That all ended following Armistice Day on November 11, 1918, when American industrial giants like U.S. Steel, the nation's largest employer, reinstated the 12-hour workday and refused to acknowledge labor unions. Still merged with the Amalgamated Association of Iron, Steel, and Tin Workers since the outbreak of war, the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, dragged their feet against demands by some 23 different craft unions to call a strike. And after union members began to abandon their union affiliations, on September 22nd, the Great Strike of 1919 began when half of the nation's steel workers, some 350,000, walked off their jobs in 6 states, creating a domino effect in a number of different industries that eventually saw 1/5 of the nation's labor force walk off their jobs. Companies soon took matters into their own hands, using the media to paint fears of a rising tide of homegrown socialism, ethnic tension between immigrant populations, and all-out racial bias against African Americans, leading to an uptick in the Red Scare of 1919 and 1920 that painted strikers as opportunistic socialists. They also tried to turn native-born workers against immigrant workers, while newspapers fed their readerships with rumors of Russian gold supporting the American labor movement. The backdraft of negative public opinion intensified when Big Steel hired African American strikebreakers, leading to deadly race riots in Gary, Indiana, Chicago, Illinois, Washington, D.C., and 23 other American cities. As labor unions took a beating in the court of public opinion, striking workers began to cross their own picket lines in defeat, leading to the strike's conclusion on January 8, 1920, making the Great Steel Strike of 1919 a most turbulent time in American history. Today in the Daily Dose, the Haymarket Riot. During the American 1880s, industrial workers continued to protest low wages and dangerous working conditions, heating up the American labor movement with strikes and pushback against industrialists, at the same time attracting the attention of mostly immigrant socialists, communists, and anarchists, intent on dismantling the principles of American capitalism. In 1886 Chicago, after a May 3rd strike in front of the McCormick Reaper Works, police opened fire on striking workers, killing or wounding multiple protesters on the picket line. In response, anarchist leader August Spies, who had witnessed the unprovoked attack, organized a protest rally at Haymarket Square, set to kick off the following evening. "Working men to arms," read his hastily printed flyers, which soon caught the attention of a multitude of disaffected radicals and workers alike. Shortly after 8:30 on the night of May the 4th, several thousand workers and activists assembled in Haymarket Square, where Spies took to the back of a hay wagon with an impassioned speech meant to fire up the crowd, followed by a second speech by radical anarchist and former Confederate soldier Albert Parsons. Approaching 9 o'clock, police arrived to break up the crowd, prompting a radical to hurl a bomb at the line of officers, who in turn opened fire on the crowd. 7 officers and 1 civilian died in the melee, while many others suffered a wide assortment of injuries. The riot and subsequent trials set off a Red Scare-like wave of xenophobia aimed at immigrants and labor organizers, leading to even more controversial death penalty convictions of 7 Haymarket protesters, while an 8th was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Despite a dogging lack of evidence, on November 11, 1887, 4 men were hanged, while a 5th committed suicide on the eve of his execution. Reacting to public backlash over the lack of evidence behind the protesters' alleged guilt, Illinois Governor Richard J. Oglesby commuted the 2 remaining death sentence prisoners to life in prison, while his successor John P. Altgeld pardoned all 3 remaining prisoners in 1893. While the Haymarket Riot was at first seen as counterproductive to the labor movement during the Industrial Revolution, it ultimately served as a turning point for American labor, leading to the formation of the American Federation of Labor, while inspiring a renewed passion for labor and leadership in the decades to come. And there you have it, the Haymarket Riot, today in the Daily Dose. Get your nerd on with the Daily Dose. And if you enjoyed today's episode, share the link with a friend or colleague so that they too can learn something new every day.